Hello and welcome to this first video for your Edexcel A-Level History course. This is the first lesson that we'll do where we'll go over William II and Henry I. It will be in the format of a video which you can access on YouTube. You can pause it as we're going along, as and when I say, and as and when you want to. And there are a series of tasks that go alongside this which have been emailed out and put on Show My Homework as well. So if you want to make a start and get down your heading for today, which is how did William II become King of England? So our main focus of today is to consider the events of William I's death. He dies in 1087 in September, and obviously we would expect the inheritance to be relatively straightforward, passes on to the eldest son in line of, in lieu of primogeniture. But obviously, because we've looked at William I already, we know that things are quite complicated, so his death is just as complicated as well. We'll try and explain what decision he made and why that causes issues for the country, and really perhaps why he put himself in such an awkward position when it came to his inheritance. With that, we can then make this judgment as to whether or not he chose wisely. We're going to look at a few sources as well that are relevant, and we'll try and get a bit of 20-mark practice done in as well. So, first thing that I want to say is, obviously you're at home at the moment. I would recommend that you buy that Edexcel textbook for yourself. You can get a copy on Amazon. It is quite expensive, but it's a worthy investment because it covers all of your content for the Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman kingdom component and the Crusades element, which we'll try and get onto after the Easter break, after a few lessons where we'll finish off William II and Henry I. The other books I'd recommend are part of the Penguin Monarch series. They're relatively cheap. On Kindle as well, they're especially cheap, so if you've got a Kindle, you can access them. The William I one is excellent, covers everything that we've looked at so far. The William II one is really short, as they all are really, and it's got some really good interpretations that we can use when we're looking at William II's content. And the Henry I one as well is particularly useful for when we're looking at the church. So if you're wanting to make a worthy investment, I'd say if you can try and get certainly the William I book, but the William II and Henry I ones might be useful as well. So just to explain what we've got left to study, we've got a number of components that go across three of the different units. So the first unit was all about Anglo-Saxon England, and obviously William II and Henry I aren't applicable when we're looking at that. But these are the topics that we've got left. Now, the logical thing to do would be to say, okay, we'll look at the first unit, William II and Scotland, then we'll move on to William II's relationship with the church, then Henry I's relationship with the church, and then on to the situation in Normandy. We're not going to do that. We're going to do this in reverse. We're going to start with Normandy, and we're going to look at 1087, the year of William's death, and we're going to start considering what William II does and the problems that he has within Normandy itself. So we'll actually cover Unit 4 in quite a lot of depth up until Henry I. We'll then assess William II when it comes to the church and with Scotland, and then we'll move on to Henry I. So it'll be more of a chronological approach that we take rather than the thematic approach that this particular exam board want you to focus in on. So to William I, the main question that we need to consider today is, what does he do with his inheritance? So the situation is this: in the summer of 1087, William has issues surrounding Normandy, particularly to do with the French king Philip I's garrison at Mons, and they begin raiding into Normandy. Now, at this point, he's not a young man. He's in his 50s. He's extremely fat, according to most of the chronicle accounts from this time, but he is still a fighter, so he goes on the offensive. Unfortunately, however, he has a bit of an issue. So as he's riding through the burning streets of the town, what happens is his horse took fright, and it flung him against the pommel of his saddle. So as a consequence, William is in absolute agony. He's obviously suffering from internal bleeding, and he knows that he's going to die. He's sent to the priory of Saint-Gervais, away from the noise of the city, and he's left there really to die. He's got two of his sons present with him. He's got William Rufus, and he's got Henry Beauclerc, who are his two younger sons that have survived adulthood. And they're there by his bedside. He's got time to think, and he's got time to decide what to do. So what we need to try and work out today is how would we advise William I? Before knowing what he actually does, let's consider the best kind of routes that he could take. So these are the things that we've got to consider. What's William's situation like in England at this particular time? We know that around 1087, 1086, there's the threat of a potential Danish invasion. We know the changes that he's made to the towns and to the villages, and the changes to the legal system and to the economy. What does he have to do in England? Is this a safe, stable country that is going to be something that's going to be easily inheritable? What about William's control in Normandy? We've considered that in the past few lessons. We've considered the threats that Philip I of France posed. What about the wealth that he's accumulated? We've said that William perhaps was the most wealthy English individual to have ever lived. His wealth in modern day terms, would account to being a multi-billionaire. What would you do with that particular component? And then finally, with the three surviving sons that he's got, Robert Curthose, William Rufus, Henry Beauclerk, what does he do with them? Robert is the eldest, and by the line of primogeniture, all of his inheritance should go to him. So how would you advise William at this particular point? On your worksheet, jot down a few ideas, and what we'll do is we'll go through on the next slide what he actually does, but we'll also throw in a number of other points for you to consider. So jot down your initial thoughts just on a bullet point if you pause the video here. Now at this point you should have a few different ideas as to what William should do with his inheritance. You might just go for the conventional primogeniture route, that's completely fine, but just make sure that you've thought about the reasoning behind it. Now what I'm going to do at this particular point is just add a few more factual pieces of information for you to consider whilst you just finalise that particular piece of advice. So the image that you can see on the screen now is the supposed, it's a rough estimate with the territories around Normandy, but the territories that William controls by 1087. You can see as well that there are a number of different marches for him to consider. So you've got the issue of Scotland, the issue of Wales, which he has launched a chevauchée style attack into, but it isn't necessarily a land that is completely under his domain. And we've got Maine as well, and really that issue surrounding Philip I of France. We've also got this particular diagram that I've just quickly put together, which is William's surviving children. So Matilda by 1087 is dead. It's his loving, adoring wife. They are first cousins, remember, but they do have a very intimate relationship. It's one based on mutual trust, and that's somebody that has been by his side and has also been a mediator with William and his eldest son, which is Robert Curthose. We know the problems that Robert caused William in the 1070s, and in the 1080s, not really much has changed, to be honest. Robert is travelling, quite a bit wider than he has done before. He's done a little stint on the tournament circuit, so he's gone to different parts of Europe where he's fought against different knights. That's really just to raise money and raise prestige. He is renowned as a very strong military campaigner. He has as well fallen out with William by 1087 again. In 1084, he's fled William's court. He's gone into exile. And this is one of the reasons why he goes around this tournament circuit. This is a man that is starting to become known throughout Europe, particularly in Italy and in Germany. And William is constantly having to think about what his eldest son is doing. And by the laws of primogeniture, which William has established in England as well, and he's passed that on as the way in which land and title should be passed down, is a really tricky point for him because he doesn't have that same relationship. If we look at his second son, Richard, unfortunately he's dead by 1075. So then we have his third eldest son, who's William Rufus. Rufus is the Latin word for red. I think it might be down to perhaps his red hair, or potentially about the fact that he's quite prone to getting angry and becomes red-faced. We then got Henry Beauclerk, somebody who is quite young by this particular time, but is somebody that is in William's court, somebody that William trusts. William has a number of daughters. A number of them we don't know for certain their names, we don't know for certain their lives and what exactly they did. The two that perhaps are of note, and unfortunately this is the nature of the time that we're looking at a patriarchy, are important for who they marry. So Constance has married Alan IV, the Duke of Brittany, and perhaps secured a marriage alliance there, so there isn't necessarily that same issue of Brittany becoming a problem. And Adela, who marries Stephen of Blois, who we'll come to when we look at the Crusades course as well. So he's somebody who's located a bit more northeast of Normandy. Now, they have to consider, William has to consider, and you have to consider all of those particular points, but there's also a number of key individuals or key issues that I just want to throw some particular points to. So we've mentioned already about this potential Danish invasion. Well, we know in 1086 and 1087, when we looked at the Domesday Survey, that King Canute IV of Denmark, who's the son of Sweyn, was threatening invasion of England. And there's this constant fear that there's Danish ships that are going to raid English shores. England is preparing for a potential invasion from there. With Malcolm of Scotland, there's been consistent problems and raids and border reaving that's taken place in the 1070s. William has established control and he's pushed into Scotland. He's not had an all-out conflict with Malcolm, but there is that continual threat, and that's something as well that he has to consider. On the continent, Philip I of France has been a consistent thorn in William's side. He's gathered together a number of disgruntled people that have been against William or have reasons to take issue with him. And by 1087, the reason why William goes over to Normandy in the first place is to try and deal with one of these threats that Philip has masterminded as well. So is it the case that the person that he wants to inherit his titles should be an ally of Philip I, like Robert is, or perhaps taking Philip on the offensive and perhaps going for somebody that William had a greater allegiance to, so somebody like William, Rufus, or Henry. Another person to consider is Archbishop Lanfranc. Back in England, he's been incredibly effective at sorting out the corruption with the church and changing the church to his and William's vision. Again, that's somebody that, does he want to change? Does he want to change the church, or does he want to keep the same? Odo of Bayeux, so that's William's half-brother, isn't dead by this point. He is somebody that is in prison, and there are a number of other people that William has placed in prison over his time that, that could potentially cause further rebellions, based on who perhaps might inherit the throne. What should happen to these people? Should they be killed in prison? Should they be released? Should it be up to the person that inherits the titles and the lands? The final thing that I want to say is, we've already spoken about the importance of the church and the importance of religion at this particular time. William, for all of the macabre ways in which he's dealt with people, cutting off their hands, cutting off their feet, how ruthless he is a Christian man. And the thing that he's thinking probably in the summer of 1087 as he's lying there at Saint-Gervais, the Priory of Saint-Gervais, is his own soul. Does he want to leave England in a position that is going to cause more issues, is going to cause more heartache, is going to cause more problems in his own family, or does he want to draw a definitive line in the sand with this particular issue? So if you pause here and just make a definitive suggestion now, what advice would you give William as he's on his deathbed in 1087? What we'll do in the next slide is we will look at what William actually does. Now, in the space that you've got at the bottom of your page, I'd now like you to write down what William actually did. So what we'll do is we'll give the basic overview at the start and just say this is his inheritance, and then we'll delve a little deeper and we'll try and think about the potential consequences of this particular decision. It is quite complex. So in most cases of English history that's happened since, I don't know whether it's because they've learnt from this particular mistake, but we see a far more straightforward passing on to the eldest line. So here's what he does. With Robert, as his firstborn son, he bequeaths the lands that he inherited as Duke of Normandy. So Robert becomes Duke of Normandy, hence why in the past we referred to him as Robert of Normandy. But when it comes to England, those are lands which have been taken by conquest. And quite unusually, what William does is he says to William Rufus, his second eldest surviving son, that he would inherit the lands of England. So William Rufus becomes William II. The third son, Henry Beauclerc, is given about £5,000, which is about 90 times that in today's money. So it's a sizable fee, but it's certainly not comparable to the previous two individuals of Robert and William and what they've inherited. Henry is quite young at this time, but it is nowhere near the amount of money that's available for William to pass on. What William also does, which is quite an unusual part to do, is he says that in order to please God, he's obviously fearing for his own soul, he orders the release of all of his prisoners. So the people that includes people that we haven't mentioned for quite a while. So Wulfnoth, who is King Harold's Godwinson's brother, the only brother that was really left after the Battle of Hastings, he's been held hostage since 1051, so well before the Battle of Hastings, well before William has established control in England. He's been released. Earl Roger, following the Earls' revolt of 1075, he's released. Morcar, that Anglo-Saxon thorn in William's side in the first few years of his reign, so around about 1066 to 1070, he's released as well. The one exception that William said at the very start was Odo of Bayeux, his half-brother. He said he cannot be released. But after some pleading by those people that were around him on his deathbed, William relented and said that even Odo of Bayeux would be released. So what I'd like you to do with this particular activity is I'd like you to write that down on the space that you've got at the bottom of the worksheet. And I'd like you to draw some lines now next to the points that you've got and the space that you've got around it to say whether or not these are changes that are going to bring about positive changes, and we can justify and we can say these are reasons why this would have a positive impact on the next generation, and likewise ways in which it's going to have a negative impact. So I'd like you to do that for the four main decisions of William's inheritance. So for each one, grab a green pen. You can draw a line and write down the reasons. If you've got a green pen, you can write it down as well. But I'd like you to do that for all four of those points. And I'd like you to do the same considering the ways in which this is going to bring about negative change. If you want to do this cumulatively, and if you want to say here are the negative negative consequences, here are the positive consequences from this decision, you can obviously do that as well. But if you pause the video now and have a go at that particular task. And sorry, just a slight amendment. It's not 90 times that in today's money, it's about 70 to 80 times that in today's money. With the previous task, you've probably started to form your own judgment as to whether or not William made a smart decision. And really, that's not necessarily the task that we're trying to aim towards at the very end. I know that it is the final lesson objective, and I do want you to come to your own judgment on this, but I would find it highly doubtful that there would be a 20-mark essay question that would be based purely on the deathbed decision of William I. You could be asked to consider it in the previous essay that we attempted, which was about the ways in which William dealt with the threats of Normandy, and part of Robert of Normandy, and Philip I, we could talk about the decision that he makes. But what I'd like to finish off with today is to look at these two sources which have been provided by Edexcel, and in which we can do a bit of source practice on. So if there was a 20-mark source-based question, it could be something like, how far can the historian use sources 9 and 10 to investigate William's deathbed decision in 1087? So the two sources that they provided are really the only sources that we have. when we're looking at William's deathbed decision. There are a few other accounts, but the vast majority of them are second-hand, which is a bit like Orderic Vitalis as well. And we do have a bit of information from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but it doesn't really talk about the decision itself. So the two sources that you've got, like I say, the first one is by Orderic Vitalis, and the second one is from an anonymous monk, which is the obituary of William, King William, which is perhaps this is the record that we've got, which is closely, most closely written to the time and near to the events in which they took place. So if you go to the next pages of your worksheets, you'll see both of these sources, and we're going to go through source 9 together, and then I'd like you to look at source 10 and hand that to me. Source 9 here then is the first one that we'll have a look at. I'm not going to write out all of the worksheet for you. I'm just going to point out a few things that you might want to consider, you might want to record and use as part of your answers. But I'd like you for the tasks for source 9 and 10 to complete those and to send it through to me by the end of the week. So with source 9, the first thing to state is we're going to look at the provenance. It's not the order in which the worksheet states, but this has been written by Orderic Vitalis. Now, Orderic Vitalis we've come across before. He's born roughly around 1075 to a hybrid family. So he's half English and half French, which gives us a very unique perspective. He goes over to Normandy after I think about the age of 11, so it's roughly around the time of William's death. So he certainly is a contemporary of the time. He wasn't writing at the specific time of 1087, but he is somebody that was alive, perhaps knew people that were recording the events. So we can't necessarily discount it just because it's written after 1087. We think that it's written between about 1114 and 1141. And he's using his obvious literary skill. This is part of the ecclesiastical history of Europe at this particular time. So he is writing it with the hat on that he's a monk and is writing this on behalf of the church. So he is writing this partly based on hindsight, but I don't think we can necessarily discount it just on that. And now to the content. So what we're trying to look for is 3 different inferences that we can make about William's deathbed decision from this. Now, we know that this isn't necessarily the exact wording of what William said, but we can still infer a number of different points from this. The first is this first line where we have, "I invested my son Robert with the Duchy of Normandy before I fought against Harold on the heath of Senlac." So he's recognising that Robert is his natural successor to the Dukedom of Normandy, and he's done this prior to 1066 in line with the laws of primogeniture. So that would perhaps be our first inference. We would perhaps use contextual knowledge to explain why William makes the decision to give Normandy to his firstborn son. You've also got in the second part of that sentence, and has received the homage of almost all the barons of the country in honour of the country. The honour then granted cannot be taken away from him. So he's not discounting primogeniture. The second inference that we would perhaps talk about is this next line where it says, "Yet I know for certain that any province," so province, we're thinking England there, "subjected to his rule will be most wretched." So he's recognising the flaws of Robert, and I think it's quite hypocritical for William to say that any province subjected to his rule will be most wretched, considering what we know happens to the north in the latter half of the 1060s under William's harrying. But that is something that we could use as an inference to investigate William's deathbed decision in 1087. He's really then stuck the knife in here. He's a proud and foolish fellow, doomed to suffer prolonged and grim misfortune. And in terms of contextual knowledge, we can talk about the movements of Robert, the fallings out, the various fallings out that he's had with William, and how this has really been quite a consistent feature throughout William I's time as Duke of Normandy and as King of England. So that perhaps would be my second inference that I would focus in on it. And really, so far, I'm just going in order of the sentences that we've got. The final one is the part that is quite unusual, and we've got to think about when he's writing this as well. He's writing this in 1114, 1141, after the death of William the Conqueror and after the death of William II. So it might be that you want to do a bit of research as to what this might suggest. And this final inference, it might be easier to do this when we finished looking at the entire course and we've looked at Henry I as well. But if you read along with me, I name no man as my heir to the kingdom of England. I mean, that's pretty definitive. And we've just said that, Robert was given the dukedom of Normandy, and William was given England, and he was told that he would be the king of it. This is, completely in contrast to that. I name no man as my heir to the kingdom of England. Instead, I entrust it to the eternal Creator, to whom I belong, and in whose hands are all things. Now, that would link into our point about William considering his soul, considering his own own life and what's going to happen to him after he dies. But it doesn't necessarily discount William as his successor. I entrust it to the eternal Creator. So what he's saying is that God will choose the next king of England. If that happens to be William, then that's God's wish. That isn't necessarily me. So he's covering his back almost with this particular decision. It's a really interesting line at the end, and I'd suggest that you continue your research onto that particular point. So what I'd now like you to do is the final task, and the task really for today's lesson is to look at sources 9 and 10 and to complete the table activity that you've been given. Source 10 is a little longer, but it is something that gives a good contrast to source 9, and perhaps if we're looking at reliability and usefulness, it might be a bit more useful to us. So that's it for today's lesson. Next lesson, so that will be after the Easter break, we will look at what William II does when he becomes King of England. In 1088, he's crowned King of England. 1087, in 1088, what issues does he have to deal with? Really, the main issue is Bishop Odo, who comes back again to cause problems. Robert gets involved as well, but it's the main thing that William has to deal with as new King of England. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and if you've got any feedback with regards to the new format, that would be extremely helpful. Have a nice Easter break, and I'll see you after.